Excellent.
Great.
Well, morning, James. Thank you so much for joining me at the
Sure.
Virtual Management Summit. Most of you out there probably know James. I'm sure he's a very familiar face in our industry, but James is the Editor-in-Chief of HM and a hotel industry advisor. He's also an award-winning anchor of the Wayfarer Executive Travel TV show, and I'm delighted to have him join me this morning and have me interview him. I just wanted to start off, James, with, I know you're a bit of an aviation buff, so to get started, did you have a good vantage point and watch the final 747 take off the other day?
No, I was actually in the hangar when it was being reversed out, so I didn't get to see it take off. But I did a big segment on it with 7 News about the final flight and what was going on. So yeah, it was a bit tricky to get from the hangar, rush out to the runway, but yeah, no, saw it in the hangar up close and personal. So yeah, but very much a milestone for Australia. It's interesting to see what things can do in travel. I mean, like if you look at the history of tourism in Australia, I think before that plane arrived, I mean, inbound tourism was almost non-existent. It was on very small pieces. So the plane really did open up Australia to the world from a tourism standpoint, all through Asia, through the Americas, and obviously Europe. So yeah, absolute godsend. I think back in those days, when Qantas had it, I think Qantas's share of the international inbound market would have been about 70% into Australia at one point in the late 80s. So
yeah,
it really did sort of grow our country from a tourism standpoint. So going to be missed. It's actually the first time now for any of the travel nerds out there. It's the first time since 1959 that Qantas has not operated currently a 4-engined aircraft. So
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's all going to be more about smaller and more frequent now. So you look at what they're doing, it's obviously, hopefully smaller aircraft, more fuel efficient, that are 20-30% more fuel efficient, they can fly more of them and have more shuttle services. So we shouldn't see a drop off from a tourism standpoint. Probably more just it's probably more flights, but just smaller aircraft. I think also too, I was talking to a friend of mine who heads up PR for Qatar Airways in Doha yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest challenges they've got now is that people feel comfortable getting on an aircraft with 500 people on it. I think people are probably more inclined to be comfortable with an aircraft with 250 or 300. 500 is just a different level, like what Emirates operate pretty much their entire fleet. It's primarily A380s. So I think it's just a different number of passengers, isn't it? Knowing you can be on board with 300, that's not bad. When you start talking about fives, it's a bit of a different model. So
what do you think here in terms of, masks? They're not, they're given out, but it's still optional, apart from, traffic between Melbourne at the moment, I believe. But otherwise, it's an optional thing for people to put masks on. Do you think, say, domestically within Australia, that, that's a real deterrent possibly for people to travel, because then you're relying on other people to do the right thing, and if everyone doesn't put them on, it could maybe make people feel uncomfortable. I mean, because, obviously they have to fill that middle seat, so people are very close to each other in a confined space. So I'm just wondering, on your view, if you think it's something that should be made mandatory in order to encourage more people to get on a flight when they can.
Probably. I mean, when I went to Cairns last week, I think something like maybe 20% of the Virgin flight had masks on.
Mm-hmm.
So some people were doing it already anyway. I think it's a case of, if you look at it, you're probably more likely to catch something in a taxi on the way to the airport versus actually on the plane with the air filtration systems on board. So,
yeah,
I think aircraft we're seeing it as sort of very minimal cases apart from inbound flights. But I mean, it's a way that companies could get creative about it. I've always said that it'd be really cool if Virgin did like a black mask with a little Virgin logo on the corner of it, or Qantas did that with a kangaroo or something. People would probably wear them.
yes.
And they wear them around. They'd be able to see it, with the logo of a business on it, albeit small. But I think there's ways to get creative about it. I mean, Qatar Airways is different. You've got to have a full face shield and a mask, not just a mask on it. So you literally have to have a shield on board. So I think if it helps some people be more comfortable about it, at least the airlines are handing them out. On the Virgin flight, they were walking around handing them out. Qantas was giving them to you before you got on board. So look, if it's mandatory on Sydney, Melbourne, now, even though that no one really is going to Melbourne anyway, but I think that if it's a short-term thing, I mean, if you need to wear it on public transport in some cities around the world, like you obviously do in Melbourne, then you probably should have to on an aircraft. I don't think people would mind having to wear them. It's just a case of, is it the only touch point though? So do you hand out gloves then? Do you hand out other things? But I think we're seeing airlines slowly getting back to a bit more normality. In New Zealand, they're back to 70% of the domestic network now.
Yeah,
Qantas was saying end of July was about 50. It won't be because of Melbourne. Obviously, Sydney, Melbourne, the second busiest domestic air route in the world, is down to almost no flights. So.
And what do you think Virgin will look like when it comes out of administration, in terms of how they'll move forward, and what impact will that have on Qantas in terms of, them probably having a lower cost base and things like that? Still being
well, I think that there's a few factors on it. One is they're going to look at where they can get support. So the idea with Virgin is you would operate what you need to yourselves. So they will operate the main trunk routes where they make most of their money. Anything regional, they would get government support from. So Queensland Investment Corporation, obviously you're partnering up as well. That would subsidise intra-Queensland routes. The question would be WA. I mean, they only operate, I think, 3 New South Wales routes: Tamworth, Coffs Harbour, I think, and Byron. So this state, you don't have that. QantasLink has got like 13 destinations in the state, so it's a bit different. Melbourne, they fly no regional big flights, so they would be able to do trunk routes easily, and then they will get subsidies, I would dare say, for the other ones. And then as soon as international borders open, they'll have planes flying immediately, which is reading between the lines of what Qantas said when Alan Joyce said, look, there won't be international flying until mid next year. He was talking about his own fleet and saying that, where they're not expecting it to return from a demand standpoint for that long. But he's also then had to re-qualify to his staff saying, oh, yes, by the way, as soon as the border opens, we're back there. The problem is having all these aircraft grounded in far-flung places.
Mm.
So it was weird. It's weird seeing aircraft on the tarmac in Sydney Airport on runways, but it does mean they can actually get those planes actually back up in the air extremely fast because they're not stuck in the desert in Alice Springs or other areas like that. So that's the one thing about when the travel bounce back comes, which is going to be the biggest bounce back we've probably ever seen from a tourism standpoint in history. It's a case of how fast can airlines get their hands on aircraft? That'll be the question. And how many staff do they really need to hire? Like Qantas has furloughed a lot of staff, but they've also, I think, they've had to get rid of 3,500, 4,000 staff. So within 2 years, they'll probably need those 4,000 back. It's a case of how fast can they rehire again.
That's it. Yeah, to get the skill back. And that's the thing with the situation at the moment, and across so many industries, there's so much displacement of good talent, and then trying to get people back on in time that are well trained to meet the needs as the business comes back. It's a really hard balancing act for sure. All right, just moving to a bit of innovation now. I just wanted to touch on what sort of innovation are you seeing across various brands and things during this time, or things that perhaps they need to look at moving forward?
There's different things. Obviously, food and beverage innovation's been one. I think Overload is probably the best case on that in terms of doing their restaurant and room concept in Canberra. Well, Canberra staycations were never banned. You could actually stay in hotels the whole time. So it's more, they did that in Sydney before the hotels could reopen, and they've kept doing that with restaurants open. So that's been a really good one, I think, as well. I think, other hotels have been incentivizing with travelers. Forward bookings, I know everyone's talking, they are picking up a little bit, Outside of that, I think it's just become benchmarking versus innovation, I mean, there are some that had sanitizing stands immediately. The problem now for a lot of those companies is actually they can't procure them fast enough from their own suppliers. So hotels that have just got little hand pumps on their desks can't get the full sanitizing stations because there's a backlog in trying to get them from a lot of suppliers. So
right.
But it's interesting to see I hope these all stay in place now. I mean, I think a lot of innovated, apart from the plastic shields at check-in, I think having sanitizer stations on every floor and the lift wells, reducing people in elevators, I've got no problem with. It's always a bit of a weird one. So I think there's ways to do it. And I think also too, like other hotel groups have been doing of late, have been things like their drinks trolleys for happy hour.
Yes.
So I know that in some hotels where they've had a club lounge access, I'm pretty sure Sofitel Darling Harbour is one of them, where they've had a drinks trolley go around on the floors that actually bring the drinks around to your rooms because the club lounge isn't open. So they're still doing the drinks for their club guests by actually bringing them to the rooms versus actually having a drinks trolley versus actually getting the club lounge open. So it's a way to still offer the same perks, but just do it a little bit differently at the moment. So
and you're right.
Good benchmarks on there.
And hopefully some of them can be sustained as things normalise.
Well, it helps them retain the rate too, doesn't it? So if they can get a better rate for a club room, they can still offer club facilities without actually having the club lounge open. So.
That's it. All right. Now, you've been running some high leadership webinar sort of series, and you're obviously well connected to a lot of our the leaders of our, big chains out there. So what's the word on the street with them? What are they talking about? We're seeing IHG, it's still signing deals, and what are they talking about in terms of outlook for the industry?
Well, in terms of like signings, we know that Marriott's going to do a record year. IHG will do a record year of new signings. So these are all 2022, 2023 projects primarily, which is good to see they're still coming forward. There's a lot of projects that are still happening in the coming years, so they're not really sort of slowing down. Some are slowing down a tiny bit, some actual projects. We saw W Melbourne slow down a tiny bit, a few others have slowed down. Other ones have brought it forward. So Crown Plaza Adelaide was due to open in October, it's now September. So I think it's more of a case looking at the moment of what happens in terms of borders, right? So Queensland is in a very high demand in a lot of areas. I know if you try and book a holiday in Noosa in the September school holidays, it's pretty much booked out, almost impossible. There's been high demand for Cairns for September onwards. A lot of Cairns, Cairns, don't forget, is an interesting town because it relies extremely heavily on the inbound traveller market. So out of the US, out of Japan, Korea, Europe, right? So
March, and it was like a ghost town because they'd stopped them coming in since about January. So yeah. But
even cities like that, you've got like Crystal Brook have got a beautiful new hotel open now. There's two others that are brand new that haven't opened yet. So even their restaurants have only been Thursday, Friday night. During the week, there's actually nowhere to eat in the hotel, when most restaurants around Cairns are closed. People weren't confident of booking a trip until the border was actually physically open.
Yes.
So now that happened, they've all got spikes in bookings. So the Northern Territory closing to every Sydney side and not just certain suburbs.
Yeah.
Effectively, I don't think, but the confidence is a bit lost because if someone goes and books, they've got to cancel. And we know in Australia there's been a huge uproar about the cancellation policy.
So let's talk about events. There's so much uncertainty. How are you managing that with your own events?
Our conference, as you know, in Sydney, to Sydney, and we've had to move it 3 times so far this year. If we'd booked a Jetstar ticket, you'd be flying nowhere. And so when we looked at rescheduling them in March for later this year, almost impossible to get dates between September and December in every major city in Australia. We have a clear indication of how you can hold events safely and what the distancing between people is. There's a lot of events that could fill hotels up, and on top of that, you've got weddings.
Whole year planning an event, but at least sometimes events a 2 to 3 window to really plan that event that runs success. 2 to 3 month window.
So James, what are your plans for your own successful conference, AHICE, for this year?
Sydney. So morning of the 8th will be design in from 9 to 12, 9 to 1, and then AHICE starts at lunchtime. As you know, one of the biggest challenges of doing a conference in Sydney was if it's going to be in September, and at the time we thought, it's going to hopefully come good, which it was for a long time. And we want to be like one of the first things in spring. And actually, one of the most in-demand topics we asked our planning committee and a lot of our attendees, and revenue management was one of the top best practice, I think, is what people want to know. So I'm sure they'll be listening to you for a few tips on day 2 in the morning. So
thank you.
So I wanted to touch on Airbnb now. Do you feel that Airbnb is a stronger threat possibly now, especially for standalone properties where people can control their own space in terms of social distancing, and given that many people may even still clean a hotel room themselves, so it's to their own standards? And what are your views on that?
The best analogy I've got to that is Uber, and I haven't caught an Uber during 7 days a week, 12 hours a day driving people around. They're not professional drivers. So same thing with Airbnb in terms of, I think, maybe that's what needs to happen in that industry in terms of, we've obviously talked about it for years in terms of needing, different regulations. From a friend of mine had a birthday in Mudgee a few weeks ago.
Right.
Couldn't get a hotel room. Obviously, Parkinson's and everything was sold out, so they had to get an Airbnb through. My mum lives in Bowral, Airbnb, and I think it's a case of in some regional areas there's so much demand from a regional tourism standpoint that I think people are hard to get for that sector. I think they're going to have to pretty quick if they don't want to be wiped off the map, so to speak. Because at one point in time, one point coming up forward,
worry about meeting other people in lift lobbies and in lifts and lobbies and things like that.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to sort of observe.
I just wanted to touch on hotel quarantine now and the possible implications on brand, given that there's been some negative press. And what are your views on that?
Interesting. Yeah, weird thing. All these cop cars at the front of hotels for a long time. So what? It's just there's a problem. It's not. It's just we actually had New South Wales Police in this state making sure
And what about the images in the media?
Showing images of those hotels. As someone in the media, when they say to a camera person, go out and get some footage of where they're all staying, then that'd be feel for those hotels. But I don't think the media was doing the wrong thing by on purpose, showing those brands off. I think they were just showing the sense of place. It's been so careful. So I think it's just and also too, don't forget, after quarantine does go, there is a gap between then and when guests are back in the hotel. So we managed it very carefully in this state from a quarantine perspective. And I think, to me, in terms of, people who want to come see their loved ones from New Zealand should be allowed to come in. It's different when we go to New Zealand, obviously, but Kiwis shouldn't have a quarantine. Otherwise, you have to charge $1,800 a ticket just to make up the fuel revenue.
So, James, when you can travel, where will you go first?
To get to Hawaii. For me, it's easy. It's 9-hour flight, overnight flight, and you kind of have that mix of South Pacific.
Because we have another session starting soon, but it was so nice to see you, and hopefully I'll see you in person soon. And thanks very much for the time and for the interview.
No worries.
Bye.